Charles and William had barely settled into the private meeting when the atmosphere inside Windsor Castle began to change. What was supposed to be a quiet discussion about the future of the monarchy suddenly became something far more personal. King Charles had expected to hear about schedules, staffing, residences, and the practical arrangements that would eventually come with another royal transition. Instead, he was confronted with a question about Camilla's future. And this time, the conversation was not simply about what Camilla wanted. It was about what William believed the monarchy should become after Charles, and Catherine was there beside him. That detail mattered, because when Charles finally understood the full meaning of what his son was proposing, his reaction was not anger. It was silence, the kind of silence that tells you someone has just heard something they were never prepared to hear. Before we go any further, make sure you stay with us until the end, because there is one part of this story that changes the entire meaning of the announcement. And if you are new here, welcome to Royal Unbeatable. We upload royal stories and deep dives every single day, so if you enjoy following the latest developments surrounding King Charles, Prince William, Catherine, Camilla, and the future of the monarchy, take a second to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel continue bringing you these stories every day. And I want to know something from you right now. Where are you watching from? Are you watching from the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, India, or somewhere else around the world? Tell us your country in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see just how far these royal stories travel. Now, back to Charles. The reason this particular conversation matters is because it touches something much bigger than one person. It touches the question of what happens when one royal reign ends and another begins. For decades, the British monarchy has relied on tradition. Some traditions are written down, others exist because people simply expect them to continue. And sometimes those expectations become so powerful that nobody thinks to question them. That appears to be where the tension surrounding Camilla's future begins. Charles has spent years building his public role around service. Camilla has stood beside him through much of that journey. Together, they became the central partnership of his reign. But William's future reign would be different. He will inherit the crown. Catherine will become queen, and their household will become the central working household of the monarchy. That much is easy to understand. The difficult question is what happens to the people who belong to the previous reign. And that is where this story becomes complicated. Because William and Catherine are reportedly looking at the future in a way that could reduce the automatic institutional role of a former consort. In simple terms, the idea is that when a reign ends, the structure supporting that reign should not automatically continue forever. The family can remain, the relationships can remain, the respect can remain. But the machinery of the previous reign may not automatically follow the family into the next one. And for Charles, that idea has enormous implications. Imagine spending decades preparing for the crown. Imagine building a household around your role. Imagine watching the institution change around you. And then imagine hearing your own son explain that when his reign eventually begins, he intends to create a clean separation between his household and yours. That is what made the conversation so uncomfortable. It wasn't necessarily an attack on Charles. It wasn't necessarily an attack on Camilla. It was an argument about institutional boundaries. And that distinction is important, because if William had simply said, "I don't want Camilla around," the entire conversation would have looked different. It would have sounded personal. It would have sounded emotional. It could easily have been interpreted as revenge for old family tensions. But that was not the argument being presented. The argument was much colder, much more administrative, and perhaps because of that, much harder to dismiss. The next reign should belong to the next king and queen. One sovereign, one central working household, one clear chain of institutional authority. That principle sounds simple, but simple principles can create complicated consequences, especially inside a family as old and complicated as the British royal family. Charles understood that immediately. And that is why his first reaction reportedly wasn't to challenge William. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. He wanted to know exactly what the proposal meant. Would Camilla still be able to work? Would she still attend royal events? Would she remain involved with charities? Would she still have access to members of the family? Would she continue living in a royal residence? Would Clarence House remain part of her future? And perhaps most importantly, would she still have an institutional household of her own? That last question changed the conversation. Because a household is not simply a building. A household can mean advisors. It can mean communication staff. It can mean scheduling. It can mean official invitations. It can mean public engagements. It can mean briefings. It can mean access. And when all of those things exist together, they can create something much larger than a private family life. They can create a second center of influence. William appears determined to prevent that from happening automatically. But there was another person in the room who made the proposal much harder for Charles to reject. Catherine. She wasn't simply standing behind William. She wasn't there merely to support her husband. She reportedly pushed the argument one step further, and that is where Charles was said to be truly stunned. Because Catherine's position was not simply that Camilla should face a different future. Her position was that the same principle should eventually apply to her. Think about that. Catherine is expected to become queen beside William. She will likely have one of the most important roles in the monarchy. She will have enormous public support. She will have a long history of royal service. And yet the argument being made was that even Catherine should not automatically create a separate institutional court around herself if William were to die before her and George became king. That changed everything. Because suddenly, this was no longer about Camilla. It was about the institution. Catherine was effectively saying that if a future sovereign inherits the crown, that sovereign should have the freedom to shape the monarchy around his or her own reign. Not around the expectations of the previous generation. Not around the popularity of a former queen. Not around tradition for tradition's sake. And certainly not around an automatic assumption that every existing royal structure should simply continue. That was a powerful argument. But it was also a painful one. Because Charles understood exactly what it could mean. He had grown up watching the Queen Mother remain a major royal figure long after the death of King George VI. The Queen Mother continued her public life. She had staff. She had engagements. She had a residence. She remained one of the most recognizable figures in Britain. For Charles, that model was not some abstract piece of history. It was part of his childhood. It was part of his understanding of how royal families survive transitions. A monarch dies. A new monarch takes over. But the previous generation does not necessarily disappear. The family continues. The public relationships continue. The old generation remains visible. That model offered continuity. But William and Catherine appear to be asking whether continuity should automatically mean institutional power. And that is a very different question. There is a difference between remaining important and remaining structurally powerful. There is a difference between being loved by the public and controlling a royal office. There is a difference between being part of the family and being part of the machinery of the crown. William's argument appears to focus on that difference. And that is why the phrase "one household" carries so much weight. One household does not necessarily mean one family. It means one central working institution. Other members can still serve. Other members can still appear. Other members can still support charities. But the main machinery belongs to the reigning monarch. That idea could fundamentally change how former consorts operate in future generations. And it could affect Camilla first. But it would not stop with Camilla. It could affect Catherine one day. It could affect future queens. It could affect future royal spouses. And it could even affect the children of future monarchs. That is why Charles had to take the proposal seriously. It wasn't simply about his wife. It was about a possible new rule for the monarchy. And rules are different from personal decisions. Personal decisions can be reversed. Rules can become precedents. Once a precedent is established, future generations begin to inherit it. That is what William appeared to understand. He wasn't simply planning for Camilla. He was planning for George. And perhaps for Charlotte and Louis as well. The monarchy they inherit may not look exactly like the monarchy their parents inherited. That is the bigger story. But before we go deeper, I want to hear your opinion. Do you think a former queen should keep her own royal household after a new king takes the throne? Or do you believe the next reign should have one central working household? There is no right answer here. I genuinely want to know what you think. Write your answer in the comments. And if you have been watching this entire story unfold, tell me one word in the comments. Future. It lets me know how many of you stayed with us through this part of the story. Now let's return to Windsor. Charles reportedly wanted clarity. He wanted to know what would happen to Camilla. William's answer was careful. Camilla would not suddenly cease to be family. She would not be erased. She would not be humiliated. She would not suddenly become invisible. She could continue personal causes. She could remain connected to charities. She could attend family occasions. She could appear at events when invited. She could continue to live a meaningful public life. But the automatic institutional machinery supporting her as the consort of Charles would not necessarily continue into William's reign. That distinction is critical, because the story is not really about taking everything away from Camilla. It is about ending automatic entitlement to institutional resources when the sovereign changes. That is a much more complicated idea. And it creates an uncomfortable question. What happens to Clarence House? For Charles, that residence carries enormous emotional weight. It is connected to the Queen Mother. It is connected to his own years before becoming king. It became part of his public identity. And it has been associated with Camilla as well. So when William's proposal raised questions about the future of separate households, Clarence House naturally became part of the conversation. Would it remain a working royal base? Would it become a private residence? Would it be reassigned? Would it continue to support Camilla? Or would the new reign decide that its role had changed? Those questions are difficult, because royal residences are never just houses. They are symbols. They carry history. They carry expectations. They can become part of the public image of a royal figure. And that is precisely why William appears to be thinking about them now. Because once a transition happens, changing the structure becomes much harder. People become attached to familiar arrangements. Staff have contracts. Offices have routines. Charities expect access. Events are scheduled. Communication systems are established. And before anyone realizes it, temporary arrangements become permanent. William appears to want to prevent that. He wants the next reign to begin with clarity. And Catherine's involvement makes the argument even stronger, because she understands that she will eventually be on the other side of the same transition. One day, Catherine could be the former queen. One day, George could be king. And one day, she could be asked to accept exactly the same boundary she is now proposing for Camilla. That is why her position has created so much curiosity. If Catherine were simply demanding special treatment for herself while restricting Camilla, the argument would be easy to criticize. But if she is genuinely accepting the same rule for herself, the situation becomes much more complicated. It becomes less about rivalry and more about principle. That is the image William wanted his father to understand. Not revenge, not punishment, not a family feud, a boundary, a line between one reign and the next. And Charles seemed to understand that. But understanding something does not mean accepting it immediately. There is still emotion involved. Charles is not only the king, he is a husband. He is a father. He is a man who has spent decades watching his family navigate enormous public pressure. Camilla has lived through years of scrutiny. Their relationship has been judged by millions. Their marriage has been analyzed endlessly. And now, after finally reaching the throne together, they are being asked to imagine a future in which their institutional structure could end when Charles's reign ends. That is not easy, even if the principle makes sense. Even if the argument is logical. Even if the monarchy would benefit from greater clarity. Human beings do not experience constitutional change as an equation. They experience it emotionally, and Charles knew that. At one point, the conversation reportedly became much quieter. The dramatic language disappeared. The arguments became simpler. William explained that family would remain family. The crown would remain the crown. Those two things could coexist. Camilla could remain part of Charles's family, but the next king would decide what role she played within his own institution. That was the dividing line. And perhaps that was the most important sentence of the entire discussion. Family is not government. Family is not the same as the institution. Family can survive a reign. The machinery of government and monarchy must answer to the sovereign of the day. That principle sounds obvious when you hear it. But inside a centuries-old institution, making it explicit can be revolutionary, and Charles knew it. He also knew something else. William is not approaching the future as the young prince who once stood behind him. William is preparing to become king. That means he has to think differently. His decisions will not simply affect his immediate family. They will shape expectations for future monarchs, and that is why Charles's stunned reaction makes sense. He was hearing his son describe a monarchy that could be smaller, more centralized, and more clearly organized around the reigning king and queen. A monarchy where previous royal households do not automatically carry their influence forward. A monarchy where institutional roles have to be renewed rather than inherited through habit. A monarchy where the next sovereign has the final say. For Charles, that meant looking beyond his own reign. And that is never easy for a monarch, because every king wants his reign to matter. Every monarch wants to leave something behind. But sometimes the greatest legacy is knowing when to let the next generation build something different. And William appears to believe that the transition should be designed before it becomes urgent. That is why these conversations are so significant. If decisions are made only after a monarch dies, emotions dominate. People are grieving, the public is watching, the family is under pressure. Staff are trying to organize an institution in real time. But if the principles are
I wanted to
decided
take this
earlier,
opportunity
there
to
is
say
less room
thank
for
you
confusion.
personally
That appears
for
to
all
be
the
thinking
wonderful
behind the
messages of
proposal.
support and for your...
And yet one question remained. What does Camilla actually want? That question cannot simply be ignored, because whatever William and Catherine decide, Camilla is a human being at the center of it. She has her own history, her own causes, her own public identity, and her own relationship with Charles. She may not want a second court forever. She may not want the responsibility. She may prefer a quieter life eventually. Or she may believe that the experience she has gained as queen should allow her to continue certain forms of public service. Without a clear public statement from the royals, we should be careful about presenting private conversations as confirmed facts. This is where speculation and fact can easily become mixed. The broader question about royal transitions is real. The specific private meeting, wording, reactions, and future arrangements described in stories like this should be treated as discussion and speculation, unless officially confirmed. That distinction matters, because the royal family does not publicly explain every private conversation, and when information comes from commentary, reports, or online claims, viewers deserve to know what is established and what remains unconfirmed. But as a story about where the monarchy could be heading, the idea is fascinating because it reflects a much larger question. How much tradition should survive simply because it has survived before? That question has followed the monarchy for generations. The Queen Mother represented one answer. William and Catherine may represent another. The Queen Mother showed how a former queen could remain a major public figure after the death of a king. William's proposed model would place greater emphasis on the reigning monarch's authority over the working institution. Neither approach is automatically right or wrong. They reflect different eras, different public expectations, different royal families, different ideas about efficiency and continuity. The Queen Mother belonged to a monarchy that was much larger in structure. The modern monarchy faces pressure to be smaller, more focused, more transparent, more disciplined. That creates an incentive to reduce duplication. If one royal household performs the main working role, why maintain another institutional structure alongside it? That is the argument. But critics could ask the opposite question. If former senior royals remain popular and useful, why remove the structure that allows them to continue serving? That is the debate William and Catherine would eventually have to answer. And Charles would understand both sides. He has lived through both models. He knows the value of continuity. He also knows the cost of maintaining large royal structures. So his reaction is not necessarily about refusing change. It could simply be the reaction of someone realizing how much change is actually being proposed. Because once you say one household, you are not only talking about Camilla, you are talking about staff, offices, residences, public engagements, funding, security, communications, charities, patronages, scheduling, representation. Everything begins to connect. One decision leads to another. And suddenly a sentence that sounds simple can reshape an entire system. That is why William reportedly wanted to approach the issue carefully. He did not want the story to become William removes Camilla. That would turn a structural argument into a personal battle. Instead, the focus was placed on the future monarchy, the next reign, the next household, the next generation. And Catherine understood the importance of that framing. She made the argument personal only in one way. She included herself. If the rule applies to Camilla, it should apply to Catherine. If it applies to Catherine, it is no longer a punishment. It is a principle. And that may be the single strongest part of the entire story, because it changes the emotional balance. Charles can disagree. Camilla can disagree. The public can disagree. But it becomes much harder to accuse William and Catherine of targeting one individual if they are willing to accept the same limitation themselves. And that is why Charles was reportedly left stunned. Not because William had attacked his stepmother, but because William had presented a vision of the monarchy in which even his own wife would eventually have to accept the same boundary. That is a very different kind of royal decision. It is not about who wins, it is about where one reign ends and where another begins. Now imagine the future. Charles's reign eventually ends. William becomes king. Catherine becomes queen. The public celebrates a new era. The ceremonies begin. The household reorganizes. The new king chooses his own advisors. The new queen establishes her own working schedule. And somewhere outside that central structure is Camilla. Still part of the family. Still connected to Charles. Still potentially active in public life. But no longer automatically at the center of the institution.
A major marriage milestone. The royal couple celebrates their 15th wedding anniversary by sharing a new photo with their kids, Prince George.
Grow up knowing that the end of a reign means the end of its institutional household. No assumptions, no automatic continuation, no inherited second court. The next sovereign starts with a clean structure. That is what William appears to be thinking about. But there is one more emotional layer. George. Because everything eventually comes back to the future king. William knows what it means to inherit the weight of the monarchy while still being a son. He knows what it means to lose a parent. He knows what it means to have your childhood become public property. And he knows that George will eventually face pressures that nobody can predict today. William may therefore believe that George should not inherit an institution already crowded with the authority of previous generations. George should be allowed to become king, not simply become the next person in a chain of inherited expectations. That is
in
where
the snap, the family of 5 are lying in a meadow together, with George in between his parents, while Kate has Louis and then Charlotte on her other side.
She may be thinking about Charlotte. She may be thinking about Louis. And she may be thinking about the children and grandchildren who will inherit the monarchy long after today's headlines are forgotten. If the rule works, it will not be remembered as a decision about Camilla. It will be remembered as the moment the monarchy established a clearer boundary between family and institution. And if it fails, future generations could look back and say that the old system was more flexible. That is the risk. William would have to balance efficiency against tradition. Catherine would have to balance fairness against history. Charles would have to balance loyalty to his wife against responsibility to the institution. And Camilla would have to decide how much of her future should remain connected to royal work. None of those questions have simple answers. But that is exactly why the story has generated so much interest. Because behind the dramatic headline is a serious question. What should happen to a royal household when the person at its center is no longer the monarch? The answer could shape the future of the British royal family. And Charles may have realized that the answer is no longer entirely his to control. That may have been the most uncomfortable part. For years, Charles was the future. Then he became the king. Now William is the future. And eventually George will be the future. Every generation thinks it is the center of history until the next generation arrives. That is the nature of monarchy. The crown moves. The institution survives. People change. Traditions evolve. And sometimes the next generation decides that survival requires change. William and Catherine appear to be preparing for exactly that. And Charles appears to be facing the reality of it sooner than he expected. But there is still one unanswered question. Clarence House. That residence could become the symbol of this entire debate. If the next reign has only one central working household, what happens to a place historically associated with the previous generation? Would it remain available to Camilla? Would it be repurposed? Would it become a private residence? Would it become part of another royal arrangement? Or would William decide that the monarchy's future requires a different approach to royal residences altogether? That answer could reveal just how serious the proposed restructuring really is. Because words are easy, implementation is difficult. Anyone can say there should be one household. But turning that sentence into a working system requires decisions. Who moves? Who stays? Who works for whom? Who controls communication? Who pays for what? Who receives invitations? Who represents the crown? Which charities remain officially connected? Which roles become personal? Which become institutional? And what happens to security? These are the questions that transform a dramatic announcement into a real constitutional and administrative issue. That is why the story should not be reduced to Camilla loses everything. That would be too simple. The possible change is much more subtle. Camilla could remain respected. She could remain visible. She could remain part of the family. But the institutional structure around her could be different. And that distinction could become one of the defining features of the next royal era. Charles may not have expected William to raise this issue so directly. But perhaps William knows that waiting would make it harder. The earlier the boundaries are discussed, the easier it becomes to separate planning from grief. And perhaps that is why the meeting was so important. It wasn't really about tomorrow. It was about years from now. It was about preparing for a future nobody wants to imagine but every monarch eventually has to face. The end of a reign. And the beginning of another. Charles knows that better than anyone. He waited most of his life to become king. He understands the weight of succession. He understands the emotional power of the crown. He understands what it means to inherit an institution larger than yourself. And now his son is telling him that inheritance should have limits. Not limits on love. Not limits on family. Limits on institutional power. That is a difficult distinction, but perhaps it is exactly the distinction modern monarchy needs. The royal family is a family. The monarchy is an institution. They overlap, but they are not identical. And if William's vision becomes reality, that separation could become much clearer. For Camilla, that would mean her future is connected to Charles but not automatically to Charles's successor. For Catherine, it would mean accepting a future rule that could eventually affect her. For William, it would mean beginning his reign with a structure designed around his own responsibilities. And for Charles, it would mean accepting that the monarchy he leads may not be the monarchy his son inherits. That is not necessarily failure. It may simply be succession. And perhaps that is why Charles did not explode. Perhaps he understood that William was not trying to destroy his father's legacy. He was trying to define his own. Those are two different things. A son can respect his father and still choose a different path. A future king can honor tradition while changing the way it operates. And a queen can defend a principle that may eventually limit her own position. That is the part of this story worth remembering, because the headline may say Camilla's future. But the deeper story is about William's future monarchy, and Catherine's willingness to stand beside him, and Charles being forced to look beyond his own reign. The royal family has always been shaped by transitions. Some were peaceful, some were painful, some became legendary. But every transition leaves something behind. A habit, a precedent, a rule, a memory. And perhaps this is the beginning of another one. If the next reign truly adopts a one-household model, the effects could be felt for decades. Future sovereigns may inherit not only the crown, but also the principle that the previous reign's institutional structure ends with the previous reign. Former consorts could remain respected without becoming separate centers of power. Royal children could grow into their roles without automatically inheriting the machinery of their parents, and the monarchy could become more clearly centered on the reigning sovereign. But there will always be questions. Would the public accept it? Would supporters of tradition resist? Would Camilla agree? Would Charles eventually endorse it? Would Catherine continue supporting it once she experiences the realities of royal life from the other side? And most importantly, would George want the same system when his time eventually comes? Those questions cannot be answered today, and that is why this story remains a fascinating subject for discussion, rather than a confirmed blueprint for the future. What we can see is the direction of the debate. A smaller monarchy, a more centralized working household, clearer boundaries, less automatic continuation of previous royal structures, and a new generation determined to define itself. Charles may have been stunned by the proposal, but William may have been preparing for this moment for years. And Catherine's involvement may have made the difference. Because when she placed herself under the same rule, she removed the simplest accusation. This wasn't simply about Camilla. It wasn't simply about Charles. It wasn't even simply about William. It was about what the monarchy should become when the next generation takes control. And that brings us back to the beginning. Charles and William sitting across from each other. A father, a son, a king, a future king. And between them, a proposal about the future. Charles had expected a conversation about arrangements. Instead, he heard an argument about the boundaries of his legacy. And perhaps the most striking part was not that William wanted change.
In the snap, the family of five are lying in a meadow together, with George in between his parents, while Kate has Louis and then Charlotte on her other side.
Because it is easy to demand sacrifice from someone else. It is much harder to demand it from yourself. Catherine appears to understand that. William appears to understand it too. And Charles was left to consider what that means for Camilla. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. Because every reign ends, every household changes, and every new monarch must decide what comes next. For now, the central question remains unanswered. Will Camilla continue to have a separate institutional role after Charles's reign? Or will William's vision of one central royal household become the model for the next era? That is the question many royal watchers will continue to debate. And I want your answer. If you believe Camilla should retain a separate royal household, type keep in the comments. If you believe William and Catherine are right that the next reign should have one central household, type change. And if you think Catherine's willingness to accept the same rule for herself makes the argument stronger, tell us why. Read the other comments too. Because sometimes the most interesting part of these royal stories isn't the headline. It's seeing how people around the world interpret what the headline could mean. And if you have made it this far, thank you for staying with Royal Unbeatable. Remember, we upload royal stories every day. So if you want more deep dives into Charles, William, Catherine, Camilla, George, and the future of the monarchy, subscribe now and turn on notifications. That way, when another major royal story develops, you won't miss it. And before you leave, don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. We want to see just how far the Royal Unbeatable community reaches. From London to New York, from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa, from Europe to Asia. Wherever you're watching, put your country in the comments, because this story may be about the British royal family, but the people watching it are all over the world. And perhaps that is the biggest reason these stories continue to matter. The monarchy is constantly changing. Charles represents the present. William represents the next chapter. Catherine represents the future beside him. Camilla represents a generation whose role is still being defined. And George represents the generation that will inherit whatever system today's royals create. The decisions being discussed now may therefore last far longer than the people currently making them. That is why a quiet meeting can sometimes matter more than a public ceremony. No crowds, no cameras, no balcony, no national anthem, just a room, a few people, and a difficult question. What should happen when one reign ends? Charles heard one answer. William offered another. Catherine made it personal by accepting the same boundary for herself, and Camilla was left facing a future that may look very different from the one she once imagined. Whether that future becomes reality remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The next chapter of the monarchy will not be an exact copy of the last. William will eventually have to make his own decisions. Catherine will eventually help shape her own role. George will eventually inherit a system that may already have changed. And Charles, for perhaps the first time in a deeply personal way, has been forced to look at the monarchy not only as the king he is today, but as the father of the man who will eventually replace him. That is the real story behind the shocking announcement. Not simply Camilla, not simply Charles, not simply William and Catherine, but the difficult moment when one generation realizes that the next generation is ready to build something different. And sometimes, the most powerful changes begin quietly, with a conversation, a question, a boundary, and a son telling his father that the future cannot belong to the past forever. This is Royal Unbeatable. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for daily royal updates, and stay with us for the next story.